So here's some basic tenets of Marxism. It's bourgeoisie against proletariat. The bourgeoisie are the capitalists, the property owners, those sorts of people. The proletariat, working class, for all intents and purposes. The basic idea is that history itself is nothing but the, what would you call it, the documentation of the struggle of one class against the other. No, like that's wrong, but it's okay because it's too simple, obviously. It's obviously too simple. There's all sorts of motivations that people have. Some of them are economic, some of them are associated with power. But that's okay. We'll leave that. Let's give the devil his due and say, well, yeah, fair enough. There's still a fair bit of tension between the haves and the have-nots, and maybe that was even more intense in previous societies than it is now. And there's no doubt that economics plays a role in virtually everything that human beings do, and a fairly significant role. So let's accept that as a potential theory. It's simple, but maybe it's practically useful. And then there's kind of an offshoot of that theory, which is that, well, if you're a Marxist, that means you have sympathy for the working class, right? Because that's what you're saying all the time. It's like, well, the poor working class, they're all oppressed, the poor proletariat, you know, and then you're also saying, well, we're the good guys because we're standing on the side of the oppressed. And so then you might also ask what you're marginalizing when you claim that you're the good guys, because one of the things that you would be marginalizing is all of the ways in which you're not the good guys, but we can leave that aside for a moment too. So, but there's the claims, is that, you know, there's the working class against the ruling class. Another claim is the ruling class because they exploit the working class, basically stealing their excess labor from them. Another very, very, surfacely attractive claim that lacks any reasonable justification, you know, because it's predicated on the idea of the world as a zero-sum game, and clearly the world is not a zero-sum game. So when someone creates wealth, when someone is wealthy, it can be, at least at times, because they created it, not because they swiped it from someone else. I think, you know, you can think of someone like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs as a good example of that. You know, what they produced had a value that far exceeded what they garnered as a consequence of their production, even though what they garnered was very substantial. So anyways, but we'll get, like I said, we're going to give the devil his due. Okay, it's the bourgeoisie against the proletariat. We'll accept that. It's class warfare as the primary historical mover. No problem. Now, but here's one I'm not willing to give away so easily. We have sympathy for the working class, primarily, and we're good because of that. No, I'm not going to just like give that away so simply. So let's investigate that a little bit. Let's see if we can actually figure out if that's true. We'll say we use a pragmatic approach, because I'm a pragmatist in the William James sense. Or maybe you could think about it even more deeply and anciently. There's a statement in the New Testament, I think it's, by their fruits you shall know them. Fine. So we're going to walk down that road. Before we do that, so now that's another thing you have to keep in mind. Before we do that, I want to make one more detour, okay? So I like making detours and then tangling them all back together. So I want to give you a bit of a history of theories of suffering. And I'm going to compare the Marxist theory of suffering to the Judeo-Christian theory of suffering. And the Judeo-Christian, and the reason I'm doing that is because I think the Judeo-Christian theory of suffering is actually one of the foundation stones of our entire culture. And so it actually matters why you think there's suffering. And so the story that describes the entry of suffering into the world, the mythological story, is the story in Genesis, the story of Adam and Eve. And basically what happens in the story of Adam and Eve is Adam and Eve are unconscious to begin with, and they're sort of in this paradisal state. There's no death, or at least there's no knowledge of death. There's also no knowledge of self. And then Eve eats the apple that the serpent gives her, and the scales fall from her eyes, and she gives the apple to Adam, and he eats it as well, so she makes him self-conscious. They both wake up. The first thing that happens is they realize that they're naked, and they cover themselves up. And the second thing that happens as a consequence of that realization is that they come to know the difference between good and evil. And I mean, that's an insanely complicated story that's dealing with a absolutely incomprehensible number of complex phenomena simultaneously, but it basically goes something like this, is that To be aware that you're naked is to be aware of your fragility and your mortality. When you have a nightmare about being naked in front of a crowd, it means that you're exposed to the crowd. All your flaws, all your mortal vulnerability is exposed to the crowd for them to see, for you to be ashamed of, for them to judge. That's partly why we're all clothed. That's partly why why clothing is a human universal. There's many human universals, by the way. Clothing is one of them, although it's used for many different purposes. So Adam and Eve cover themselves up, and so it's because they've realized that they're vulnerable. They're naked and vulnerable. That's self-consciousness. Human beings are self-conscious animals. We're really the only self-conscious animals. Other animals have the glimmerings of self-consciousness. Some of them can identify themselves in a mirror, for example, but we have whole theories of ourselves. We have whole articulated verbal and philosophical theories of what a human being is and what we each are as individuals. So really, those aren't in the same conceptual universe. It's a whole different, it's a qualitatively different issue in the case of human beings. We're self-conscious. Self-consciousness loads on trait neuroticism, technically speaking, which means that self-consciousness is primarily something that manifests itself in the form of negative emotion. And we all know that. You're on stage, you get self-conscious. Is that a good thing? No. You can get so self-conscious that you're tongue-tied, right? It's not good. You don't want to be self-conscious on stage. Or maybe ever. You get self-conscious in the face of someone you're trying to impress. You turn all red, you stammer. It's like self-consciousness is a rough business. And it's no wonder, because you know yourself for the fragile fool that you are. It's even worse than that, because, see, it took me a long time to figure out why it was that when Adam and Eve woke up, they also developed the knowledge of good and evil. I just couldn't figure that out, because it didn't make sense to me. How self-consciousness, knowledge of vulnerability, and the knowledge of good and evil were tangled together. Or even really what the knowledge of good and evil meant. But I figured it out eventually. I thought, oh, I get it. It was like a real revelation to me. As soon as you know you're vulnerable, you know the difference between good and evil. Because as soon as you know you're vulnerable, then you know everyone else is. And as soon as you know that everyone else is vulnerable, you know how to hurt them. And so that means you consciously know how to bring suffering into being. And that's the knowledge of good and evil. And you know that because let's say that you're really good at torturing people. And there's no doubt a number of people in the audience who are actually quite good at that. And maybe you all have a bit of an affinity for it. If you're married, I'm sure your partner would testify to that. So if you're going to hurt someone, what you think essentially is, okay, what would really hurt me? And then you think, well, I'll just do that to them. It's like, that's a good theory. It's very sophisticated. So anyways, so what happens? Adam and Eve wake up. They weren't supposed to do this. God told them that they were going to be sorry if they did that, but they did it anyways because that's what people are like. And because we always learn things that knock us out of our present paradises, right? We're curious and we won't leave things alone. And maybe things are not so bad. And then you ask some questions that maybe you're not so happy about asking once you find the answer. And you fall out of your little paradise into history, and you got to work to set things right again. And anyways, God gets wind of this, and he chases Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. But he says some interesting things when he chases them out. He says, all right, now you know what's the consequence of that. And he says to Adam, you're going to have to work. Now that's cool. That's really cool. Well, he is God after all, so he knows what he's talking about. He says, you're going to have to work. So why would you have to work now that you knew you were vulnerable? Well, the answer to that is, well, if you know you're vulnerable, that stretches out into the future. You know you're going to die. You know that you're fragile. It's like maybe all your problems are solved right now. You're all sitting here. You're safe. You're not hungry. You don't want anything to drink, etc. But what about tomorrow? What about next week or next month or 10 years from now? It's like just because you got all your problems solved for this second doesn't mean you got them solved for the rest of your iterations through time. So you got to work, and the work is the sacrifice of the present for the future. And so that's exactly right. You have to work. Now you see what's interesting about that, and this is the theory that I was, and then of course God tells Eve, well, you've really, screwed things up too. You're going to have these big-brained babies, and that's a big problem. You're going to suffer in childbirth, and then they're going to be dependent on you forever, and because of that, you're going to be dependent on this man that you just woke up, and that's not going to be very pleasant for either of you, but tough luck. And so that's it. That's the curse in some sense, and it's exactly right. But the thing is, there's a theory in there. There's an interesting theory of suffering that's implicit in that story, and the theory of suffering is that suffering is built into the structure of self-conscious being. It's built right into the structure. So if you're a self-conscious being, that's your lot. It isn't someone else's fault. It isn't a consequence of sociological oppression. It isn't a consequence of the fact that our society isn't organized properly. It's just part of being. All right, so that's a big deal, because that's an important theory, because one of the questions is, well, why is there suffering, and what are you going to do about it? And it's a lot different if it's just the way it is for you, and if it's actually your fault that he's suffering. Or maybe it's the group's fault that you're suffering. Those theories are really, really different. And then in the second story, in Cain and Abel, Cain makes sacrifices to try to get it in good with God, and Abel makes sacrifices. And the sacrifices are kind of archaic from our perspective. They're burnt offerings, so the smoke goes up where God can detect it, because he's up there somewhere, up there where the stars are. And God rejects Cain's sacrifices, and we don't really know why, but it kind of looks like Cain is a second-rater, and then Cain goes and complains to God and says, like, what kind of stupid universe did you make here? I'm breaking myself in half trying to get things together, making the proper sacrifices, and nothing's going well for me. And Abel, well, everything he touches turns to gold. Everyone loves him. He's even a really good guy. It's like so annoying. What's up with this place you built? And God tells Cain, don't be coming and telling me that the entire fabric of reality is wrong because it isn't working out for you. It says sin crouches at your door like a sexually aroused predatory cat. That's basically the metaphor that God uses. And he says, and you let it in and let it have its way with you. And that's really an interesting way of putting it, because what God says to Cain is that, you're all bitter and resentful, and really it's no wonder, because, things aren't going well for you. And then you've got Abel, who's overshining you in every way. But yeah, it's your fault. This terrible thing waited at the door, and you let it in. And then you entered into a creative union with it, and you produced something as a consequence. And that's this tormented spirit that you have now. And it's polluting your relationship with reality. And that's why things aren't working out very well for you. So go put yourself together before you come and tell me just exactly what's wrong with the structure of reality. And Cain isn't very happy about that, because really, is that really what you want to hear? It's right, like, you have more misery than is necessary because you really didn't put your act together, and you know it. And you've done it creatively. And so Cain goes and kills Abel. That's the story of how resentment enters the world. And it's the first story in the Judeo-Christian canon, let's say, about actual human beings. Because Adam and Eve were made by God, so they don't really count. Cain and Abel were born. And so that's something, so there's a reaction to suffering, right? The necessity of sacrifice. And the consequence of the necessity of sacrifice is that some sacrifices work and others don't. And then if your sacrifices aren't met with the goodwill of God, let's say, well, then that makes you angry. Well, of course it does. And you can take God out of the story if you want, if you're not happy with that kind of mythological or narrative statement, but it doesn't really matter, because the whole point is that if you make sacrifices, especially if they're second rate, things aren't going to go very well for you, and you're going to get bitter and resentful and murderous and maybe genocidal. And it's really interesting, because Cain has descendants, and if you transgress against them, they don't just kill you, they kill 7 of you, and then his later descendants kill 49 of you. There's this exponential growth of murderousness as a consequence of Cain's primal fratricide. And then the next story is the flood. And that's not an accident. There's nothing in those stories is an accident. Okay, so now you've got 2 different theories about the nature of suffering. You've got the one I just laid out. It's called the foundational story of suffering. and malevolence. And you have the Marxist story, which is, well, there's oppressed people, and the reason they're oppressed and suffering is because the oppressors are oppressing them. Those are not the same theories, right? And there's a utopianism that's implicit in Marxism, which is if you could just get the damn oppressors to stop oppressing the oppressed, then the utopia would arrive. And so not only are the oppressors responsible for the suffering of the poor, they're also responsible for the fact that the utopia isn't here for everyone. And so how reprehensible can you get? Well, then that certainly justifies, that degree of malevolence justifies pretty much anything you'd like to do to them. So anyways, let's take this apart in a little more detail. Do the Marxists have sympathy for the working class? George Orwell was interested in this question. And so he wrote this book called Road to Wigan Pier, which I would highly recommend. It's on a reading list I made. It's on my website. You can check that out. Those are books that have been particularly influential to me. And so Orwell was a socialist. He wrote the book for the Left Book Club, which published a kind of a socialist book once a month. Orwell, by the time he wrote this book, he was already awake. You know, in the 1920s, after the Russian Revolution, no one really knew what to make of what was happening in what would become the Soviet Union, right? I mean, it was after World War I, the planet was in ashes for all intents and purposes. The old aristocratic order was crumbling. It was a horror show. And these revolutionaries came out with these new ideas and tried to in principle, give the working class a break, and everybody watched to see what would happen. And the honest people and the intellectuals watched, and I separate them for a reason. But by 1920, 21, 22, something like that, it was obvious already that something was rotten in the state of Denmark. Malcolm Muggeridge went over to the Soviet Union to check out how the collectivization of the farms was going, and he found out it was actually pretty murderous. Right, because what the communists did was round up all the successful farmers and rape them and kill them and steal everything they had and send them off to Siberia, which turned out actually to be a pretty bad idea. Now you think about it, those people were serfs not very long before, a couple of generations at most, and they were so not much more than slaves, and some of them had risen up to the point where they may have had a nice brick house and a couple of cows and maybe a person working for them or two, and there was a small proportion of the agriculturalists in the Soviet Union that were producing most of the food. And that's just how it goes, because that's a Pareto distribution issue. In any field where there's human productivity, a small proportion of the people produce almost all of the output. It's actually the square root of the number of people in the field produce half the output. So if you have 100 farmers, 10 of them produce half the food. But if you have 10,000, 100 of them produce half the food. Okay, so what happens when you kill all the good farmers? You starve 6 million Ukrainians to death in the 1930s. And, you know, that's not something that's all that widely known, but if you want to provide some additional fodder for your nightmares, you could go online and read about what happened to the Ukrainians in the 1930s. So that under the collectivization principles. So let's say you were a mother and you were starving to death, and so were your children, and, you know, the communists had come in and forcibly collectivized you, and then they took all the grain that your collective farm had produced and they shipped it all to the cities, eh? And so that's all done, and you think, okay, you know, the city's got to eat, and so then you go out in the field to pick up the grains that the harvesters missed so that you can, you know, the ones that they've been lying there, they're not so good, there's not that many of them. You go out and glean, you pick up the seeds that weren't picked up. So you can feed your kids so they don't die. And so what's the punishment for that? Death. Because you were obliged under the collectivization orders to turn in any additional grains that you happen to pick off the ground to the authorities so that they could be, well, who knows? But at least so they could be shipped to the cities, I suppose, which is, of course, absurd, because, of course, that would never happen. But it was mostly so that you could just actually die. So, okay. Anyways, back to the road to Wigan Pier. Now, I'm going to read you a little bit about from the book. So Orwell went out to this mining town in the northern UK. And coal miners, Orwell had sympathy for the working class. He really worked on that his whole life because he was a middle class, upper middle class, snobby type Englishman, and he knew it. And he tried really hard to overcome that. He served in the Spanish Civil War. He wandered around as a tramp. He worked in low-end restaurant. He worked as a low-end worker in restaurants in Paris and in London. He has a very good book. I think it's called Down and Out in Paris and London that describes that. Like, he was a seriously committed dude and really a smart guy. And so he's going up to these terrible towns in the northern UK where the coal miners worked and had their families. And, you know, they had hard lives. They had hard lives, and that's just saying nothing. You know, the coal miners that he met, they didn't have any teeth by the time they were 30. He said, the women he talked to said, teeth are just a misery. It's better to get rid of them as soon as you can. And they went and the men went and mined coal, and that was rough. You know, they all had black lung by the time they were 40, and they were done fundamentally. But here's just a bit of a story about how hard their lives were. So they had to go in the mines during the day, so they never saw the day, so that's one thing. They had to go to the mines, and then they had to like knock coal off the walls. That's hard, with hammers and picks and all of that, and then they had to move it. But that was their job, but there was the commute. So here was the commute. So imagine that the typical tunnel was about that high, something like that, and the typical coal miner was about that high. Well, that's a problem, because you got to walk through those tunnels to get to work. So you have to walk like this. Then the question might be, well, how far do you have to walk to work? And the answer is 3.5 miles. And that's how far you have to walk back from work after you've put your 8-hour shift in at the coal mine. And you don't get paid for the commute. And so Orwell said that was more or less like climbing a small mountain in the morning before you went to work and then climbing another one at night before you went home. And so that was just, I mean, believe me, I'm telling you very little about how tough their lives were, but that gives you a little flavor. Actually, one day like that for a modern person, you're dead, or you wish you were dead anyways. And so Orwell talks about going up there to stay in terrible places he lived in while he was up there, and the terrible food he ate, and the miserable, wretched scenes that he saw. And here's one of the miserable, wretched scenes. He's on a train through the neighborhoods. He says, the train bore me away through the monstrous scenery of slag heaps, chimneys, piled scrap iron, foul canals, paths of cindery mud, crisscrossed by the prints of clogs. This was March, but the weather had been horribly cold, and everywhere there were mounds of blackened snow. As we moved slowly through the outskirts of the town, we passed row after row of little grey slum houses running at right angles to the embankment. At the back of one of the houses, a young woman was kneeling on the stones, poking a stick up the leaden waste pipe which ran from the sink inside, and which I suppose was blocked. I had time to see everything about her, her sack apron, her clumsy clogs, her arms reddened by the cold. She looked up as the train passed, and I was almost near enough to catch her eye. She had a round, pale face, the usual exhausted face of the slum girl who's 25 and looks 40 thanks to miscarriages and drudgery, and it wore, for the second in which I saw it, the most desolate, hopeless expression I've ever seen. It struck me then that we, meaning the middle class at that time, are mistaken when we say that it isn't the same for them as it would be for us, and that people bred in the slums can imagine nothing but the slums. For what I saw in her face was by no means the ignorant suffering of an animal. She knew well enough what was happening to her, understood as well as I did how dreadful a destiny it was to be kneeling there in the bitter cold on the slimy stones of a slum backyard, poking a stick up a foul drain pipe. All right, so Orwell writes the first part of the book, and it details the lives of these people. And then he makes an argument. He says, like, how can you read about this? How can you know about this without having some sympathy for redistribution schemes and socialist ideas? And so he's actually asking himself this question. It's not just a rhetorical question. He's a serious guy, right? He goes up there and he tells you a story that, you have to have a heart of stone if you read that, you don't think, man, something should be done about this. It's really awful. So he's set up this situation where your sympathies are completely with the people that he's describing. But socialism wasn't all that popular in Britain at that time, and socialists weren't all that popular with Orwell. He didn't really like them that much. And he was trying to figure out why that was. So this is what he wrote in the second part of the book. Now, this got him in a lot of trouble. They didn't want to publish his damn book after he wrote the second part. But he fought with them and he got it published, and it's a classic, and people still read it, and you should read it because it's a great book, and Orwell's a great writer. And Orwell was another one of those people, intellectuals, who woke up pretty early. You know, Orwell wrote Animal Farm in 1984. He wrote 1984 and 1948. Wrote Animal Farm approximately around the same time. He knew what was happening under Stalin, and he wasn't afraid to say it. But it was a message that in some sense fell on deaf ears, especially among the intelligentsia. And there's complicated reasons for that. But it wasn't like the facts weren't there for people to see them if they wanted to. And as I already said, Malcolm Muggeridge had made it pretty clear in the 1920s, and that was widely publicized, by the way, throughout the UK, what was happening during de-kulakization, the kulaks being the farmers that I talked about earlier who had committed the unspeakable sin of crawling out of their serf status over a couple of generations to the point where they weren't mere property and half-starved. So this is what Orwell had to say about socialists. It might be said, however, that even if the theoretical-oriented, book-trained socialist is not a working man himself, at least he is actuated by a love of the working class. He's endeavoring to shed his bourgeois status and fight on the side of the proletariat. Obviously, that must be his motive. But is it? Sometimes I look at a socialist, the intellectual, tract-writing type of socialist with his pullover, his fuzzy hair, and his Marxist quotation, and wonder what the devil his motive really is. It's really difficult to believe that it's a love of anybody, especially of the working class, from whom he is, of all people, the furthest removed. The truth is that to many people calling them socialists, revolution does not mean a movement of the masses with which they hope to associate themselves. It means instead a set of reforms which we, the clever ones, are going to impose upon them, the lower orders. On the other hand, it would be a mistake to regard the book-trained socialist as a bloodless creature entirely incapable of emotion. Though seldom giving much evidence of affection for the exploited, he is perfectly capable of displaying hatred, a sort of queer, theoretical, in vacuo hatred against the exploiters. Hence the grand old socialist sport of denouncing the bourgeoisie. It is strange how easily almost any socialist writer can lash himself into frenzies of rage against the class to which, by birth or by adoption, he himself almost invariably belongs. Now, I worked for the NDP when I was a kid, and I had privileged access to the leadership for provincially and federally for reasons that I won't go into, and I thought that many of them were honorable people who were really striving to give the working class a voice. And I believe that the working class needs a voice, a political voice, for obvious reasons. I think the Democrats in the United States have made an absolutely dreadful, abysmal mistake replacing their working class political ethos with identity politics. We're going to talk about that. And I don't think the situation has changed that much. I think one of the things that's happened in the United States is that world stability and peace, in some ways, has been purchased at the expense of North American working class well-being. You know, because the Chinese have got rich compared to 30 years ago, 40 years ago, 50 years ago. The Indians have got rich, again, same comparison basis. There's more middle-class people in India now than there are in the United States. The trade arrangements that have been in North America allowed for the rise of middle classes globally, at the same time, they opened up the working class in North America to competition from those low-wage sources. And maybe that's a good deal. It's hard to say, right? Because it's not such a bad thing that the Chinese aren't starving, and it's not such a bad thing that the Indians aren't starving, and that those societies are transforming themselves actually into communities that are quite wealthy. It's like, hooray for that. It's an absolutely miraculous transformation. It's the most rapid growth of human wealth in the history of humanity. So we should be pretty happy about that. But we should also remember, at least to some degree, who's paid the price for it. And so, as far as I'm concerned, the working class needs a voice. And it isn't obvious that they have one at the moment. Having said that, however, it isn't obvious to me at all that the people who purport to stand for the working class actually do so, or that if they do so, that the reason they do so is because they're all compassionate and sympathetic and loving and kind and saint-like. I'm more convinced by Orwell's argument. So back to the NDP. The people I met at the leadership level, a lot of them I had a fair bit of admiration for, but as I worked with the party over about a 5-year period, there was this contradiction that kept emerging for me, and that was that I didn't really like the low-level party functionary activist types. Like, they just weren't personally appealing to me. They seemed peevish and resentful. And then, at the same time, I was going to college. I was about 17. I got elected to sit on the college board of governors, and at that time, Alberta was conservative, politically, right? It still is, of course, but it was part of the progressive conservative empire, because they ruled Alberta forever. And all the Board of Governor members were basically nominees, right? They were conservative nominees, so these were conservative people. And I was an NDP member, and I thought, and I'd worked for small businessmen too who weren't NDP. They were conservative. I could never figure that out, but I'll tell you about that in a minute. But I had a bad case of cognitive dissonance, because it actually turned out that I admired the people on the Board of Governors. And they were mostly, it was in Grand Prairie, it's not a very big place, and it's not very old. And so if you were reasonably successful in Grand Prairie, the probability that you had inherited your money from the aristocracy was like 0, because there wasn't one, right? The whole damn town was 50 years old. So if you had any influence or wealth, you were a small businessman, small to middle-sized businessman, and you knew what you were doing. And I actually admired these people. I thought, well, that's not very good. I admire them, and I don't share their political views. And then there's these other people with whom I hypothetically share political views, and I don't admire them at all. What's going on? And then I read Road to Whig and Peer, and I thought, oh, that's it. They don't like the poor, they just hate the rich. It's not the same thing. It's not the same set of motivations. And so let's say that you're a postmodernist and you privilege compassion for the oppressed. Think, well, what do you push to the margins? Well, what are you doing with all your hatred and your resentment and your evil? It's like, you don't have any of that? That's a bad theory. That's a really bad theory. Okay, so fine. So you can say, well, yeah, you can say that, but I don't buy it. I still think that the people who stand to speak for the oppressed are in fact motivated by empathy and sympathy. Their hearts are in the right place. See, I don't really buy that either, because I don't really think, generally speaking, that it's a credible claim for someone to make that their heart is in the right place. Now, you can ask that of yourself, and if you think your heart is in the right place, well, more power to you. You know, I can't see the halo from here, however. And so given that you're just as malevolent as your neighbor, or maybe even more so, and that that's actually pretty malevolent given the intrinsic nature of human beings, I can't help but wonder what you're doing with all those traits that you're not admitting to. But you could even object, well, you know, that's a pretty pessimistic view of humankind. It's not, by the way. It's just not naive. But anyways, you could object that, and you could say, no, actually, the weight of moral authority is, in fact, on the left, even the radical left, with those who identify with the oppressed and who are working to better their conditions. Okay. Fair enough. So then let's say, well, let's give those people some power. And if they're actually motivated by compassion and empathy and desire for the working class, if you give them power and you give their ideas power, then as those ideas unfold in real time, you're going to find out, like, do things get better for the working class, let's say, or do they get worse? Because we could consider that like an experiment. We could consider the outcome proof. I don't know what else you would do. I don't know how else you would come to your decision, because it's just theory till you see it happen. Now, Nietzsche said back in the late 1800s that after he said that God was dead, and I suppose that would also mean the theory of suffering that I outlined at the beginning that is at the basis of Judeo-Christian civilization, that God was dead and that people had killed him and that we'd never find enough water to wash away the blood. It's a paraphrase, but I've got the basic message right. And he also said there'll be two consequences of that: nihilism, because there's no transcendent meaning, and a move to totalitarianism because people can't tolerate nihilism. And he said the most likely pathway to totalitarianism would be communism, essentially. He didn't quite use those words, but he meant that. The words are close enough. He said socialism, but I'm going to use communism to distinguish it from democratic socialism. And he said that probably tens of millions of people would die in the 20th century as we played out that experiment. And then he said, but it might be worth it if we learn something from it. Rough, man. I mean, and unbelievable. Like, I cannot figure out how in the world he knew that was going to happen, especially so far in advance. But Dostoevsky knew the same thing. He wrote this book called The Devils, or The Possessed. You could read that. That's a great book. It takes about 150 pages to get going. But once like everything snaps together after that, and then it moves. And it's basically his prophecy about, it's an examination of the kind of person who had arisen in the aftermath of the death of God in Russia, who would lead the communist revolution. That's essentially it. It's brilliant. It's terrifying. And it's a great intro to Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, which describes what did happen when those sort of people took over the revolution. So let's look at what happened after the revolution. And we might say, well, how about we replicate the experiment a few times? Because you know how it is. If you're running a scientific experiment, you want to find out what something does if you allow it to behave. You don't want to just run it once because, well, maybe there was something specific about those conditions that led to the outcome. You want to generalize it across multiple circumstances. So we might say, well, let's take this set of ideas and let's run it on a large scale over a very long period of time in a variety of exceptionally diverse cultures and languages. So let's do that. Okay, well, we could first start with the Soviets. People, even now, because it's like the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, are celebrating Lenin. It's like, that's not good. That's like celebrating Hitler. Okay, I'm dead serious about that. It's not good. And the fact that people can dare to think that that's okay means that there's something wrong with the way that we look at history. Lenin was a monster. And if you want to know about that, you can read Solzhenitsyn's writings about Lenin. Because the communist apologists say, well, it wasn't Lenin. Lenin was a good guy. He was all motivated by love of the working class. It's like, well, his henchman was Stalin. And if your henchman is Stalin, you're not a good guy. and Lenin was around during the early collectivization. And if you read what he wrote, you'll find out that he was perfectly willing to have any number of people die as long as his ideological system could be brought into being. So there's no celebrating Lenin. There's no we're cool, young, Marxist, hip revolutionaries, and he's our idol. It's like, there's none of that. Not if you know anything. Not if you're decent. Well, there was the death of the kulaks, I told you about that. There was the Ukrainian famine, that's 6 million gone there. There was the rise of the Gulag state because it turned out that Russia, the Soviet Union, couldn't run on the principles that it had laid down as sacrosanct. They just didn't work, so you had to enslave everybody and run your economy as a slave state, essentially. And try not to kill the people in the gulags so fast that you can't suck some productive labor out of them. There's the death of tens of millions of people. We don't even know. The estimates range from 15 to 60 million. And like, we won't get too picayune about the numbers because after the first 10 million, you kind of made your point. And the fact that we don't know between 15 and 60 is actually an indication of the horror of it. Because our count is off by tens of millions. And that's only within the last century. And then there was the 1956 crackdown on Hungary and the 1968 invasion of Czechoslovakia. Then there was the whole thermonuclear Holocaust thing that was going on at the same time, and the fact that in 1962 and in 1984 we were seconds away from complete annihilation, right? During the Cuban Missile Crisis, the keys were in the intercontinental ballistic missile release systems, and Castro, as he admitted to Jimmy Carter, in case any of you are Castro fans, which you shouldn't be, that he was perfectly willing to have Cuba annihilated if it would have meant the defeat of the United States. And then in 1984, approximately, I may have the date exactly wrong, the Russians received an indication from their early warning systems that the Americans had launched 5 thermonuclear missiles, and one Russian decided that it was a mistake and refused to launch the retaliation. And he just died about 2 weeks ago. So, that was pretty close. And so that was experiment number 1, let's say. That wasn't good, that experiment. Let's put it that way. It wasn't good. It was exactly the antithesis of good. It was precisely the antithesis of good. But that wasn't all. I mean, there's the People's Republic of China. That's a different country, seriously a different country, right? Different tradition, different language. How many people died in China under Mao? No one knows. Same issue with the Soviet Union, although Mao was a bigger monster than Stalin, and that's impressive, because there's Hitler, there's Stalin, and there's Mao. And of the 3, Mao was probably the worst. He's still revered in China. Maybe that accounts for their affinity for North Korea, which could still destroy us all, the remnants of that horrible state. Maybe 100 million people died in China during the Great Leap Forward. That's a hell of a leap forward. Well, maybe it wasn't 100 million, maybe it was only 40 million. But as I said before, when you're counting in the tens of millions, your point's already made. And then there was Cambodia and the killing fields, and Bulgaria and East Germany and Romania and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, that's North Korea, and Vietnam and Ethiopia, Hungary, etc., etc., etc. It was never a successful communist state. Cuba, I suppose, came closest, but it was radically... the Soviets poured money into Cuba, so that doesn't really count. So then the first question was, well, are these Marxists motivated by love or hatred? Well, is it love or hatred that produces 100 million dead people? And is that enough evidence or not? And if it's not enough evidence, if you think to yourself, well, that's not enough evidence, it was never really given a proper try. It's like, well, what would have been a proper try? See, I always think when I hear someone say that, I know what you think. You think in your delusional arrogance that you understand the Marxist doctrines better than anyone else ever has, and that if you were the one implementing those doctrines, you would have ushered in the utopia. That's what you mean when you say that. And You know, they say, and there's an idea in the New Testament that there's a sin, it's the sin against the Holy Ghost. If you commit that sin, no one really knows what it is, that you can't be forgiven. And I would say, well, if you want a candidate for the sin against the Holy Ghost in the 21st century, the statement, real communism was never tried, with the underlying idea that if you had been the person implementing it, it would have worked, I think that's a pretty good contender for something for which you should never be forgiven. All right, so that's Marxism.